This is a bill of sale
Oh,
for a young African-American boy.
Who's
This is
only
actually
6.
one of the things that we always talk about when we talk about the Civil War. Today we're going to talk about the Civil War, but more importantly we're going to talk about some of the great American heroes that were part of that period from the 1850s all the way to the end of the Civil War in 1865. When the war ends, what happens? People are emancipated. Okay, so guys, you understand what happened there. So you had this slavery thing, which is happening in the United States, and it's the result of an economic system, the way they actually did agriculture back then, the way they farmed. They needed lots of cheap labor. So the cheap labor actually turned out to be African slaves, and they brought them to the United States, and they were owned just like you'd own a horse or you'd own a car. They were considered property. And that's what started it. And here's one of our heroes right here. His name is Langston Hughes. He was a part of a movement called the abolitionist movement. And the abolitionist movement, what they were trying to do is to show the rest of America that when Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that applied to not just white men or brown men, but also, or Asian men, but also all African Americans. Every man, every woman was protected by and should have the same basic rights. That document's relatively the same, early 1800s, and that's the same guy, Albert Journey, and that's what they call an indentured servant. That's a young Irish boy that came over here, and he would have to work, and he'd get a Bible and a new suit of clothes every year, but he'd have to work essentially for free. So he was almost like a slave. But after 20, 30 years, he could work his way out of this indentured servant status. Imagine at 9 years old being sold to some stranger, and then you go live on his farm somewhere in Alabama, Mississippi, or Georgia, and you have to do whatever he tells you.
that's scary.
Pretty scary, right? So that's what it was like being a slave. And there's another actually interesting guy that in the anti-slavery movement, this guy by the name of John Brown. He did a big raid on a place called Harper's Ferry in what was then Virginia, now it's West Virginia. And he went in there and he tried to do a slave uprising against slavery, right?
He tried to organize.
He tried to organize the
black
slaves.
people.
And what happened is that he eventually got caught by a guy that later turned out to be the head of the Confederacy, the Confederate Army, a guy by the name of Robert E. Lee, was a colonel in the Union Army back then, right? The Northern Army, the United States Army actually. So he captured him and they hung John Brown. And you know, right down the hill here, there's a cemetery, and John Brown's wife is buried right here in Saratoga.